Thank you so much, Brian. A few years ago, I think it was on a Friday, I was off on that day, and Caroline had shared with me earlier how we were going to have ribs that night for supper. She had seen this new recipe for them online, and how it works is that you cut them into smaller pieces, you put them in the oven for an hour, and then after that you make this honey chipotle barbecue sauce, and you put the ribs in a crock pot, and they continue to slow cook for the remainder of the day, and they're supposed to be tender and flavorful, and with the honey kind of sweet with the chipotle, a little bit of spice, and so it was just going to be really good. Anyway, on this day, she needed to leave the house for a little bit, and she'd already cut the ribs into pieces, and they were in short order going to be going into the oven. She said, I need to leave for a little bit. Would you put the ribs in the oven? And they'll need to be there for an hour. And I said, yeah, I'll be glad to do that. And so she leaves. She's probably been gone 30, 40 minutes or so, and I'm recognizing she's not going to be back at home before these ribs need to come out and they're ready to go in the crock pot. So I called her on her cell phone and I said, hey, do you want me to get, when the ribs come out, go ahead and put them in the crock pot? She said, yeah. In fact, the recipe for the sauce is over on the counter. If you want to go ahead and start making that, you can go ahead and put them in there. That'd be a real help to me. And so she gives me those instructions, and I find the recipe, and the recipe for this sauce calls for a number of things. Ketchup is part of the base. There's some brown sugar. There's honey. There's some other spices, and this other stuff that I hadn't used before called chilies in adobo sauce. Chilies in adobo sauce. And so when I got to that, I thought, well, I'm assuming we have some of that in the house. I go over to the pantry, I find this little can that says chilies and adobo sauce. So I thought, okay, that's great. And so I open the lid, and inside there's this dark sauce, and there are these, 2-inch long chili peppers in there. And I thought, well, the peppers, you don't want to put the whole pepper in there like that. So I decided I'll get the food processor out, and I'll just puree all of this. And so I did that. And Caroline had told me as I'm doing this to double the recipe because we had more ribs, we needed more sauce, and so I am doubling everything, including these chilies and adobo sauce. And so I get these things pulverized and pureed, and I put whatever I'm supposed to into the mix. I get this sauce made. I throw the ribs in the crock pot. I pour this sauce over it. I cover the lid. And I'm just beaming with pride because I'm doing great help, and these things that are starting to smell really good. Caroline gets home, and she's pleased that I've been able to get all this together. And a little while, she goes in there, though, and she gets a spoon, and she tastes the sauce. And she asked me this question. She said, did you use the adobo sauce in the refrigerator? I said, I didn't know we had adobo sauce in the refrigerator. And even if we did, I would know what it was if I saw it. And so I said no, but I found the recipe called for chilies and adobo sauce. I found that can over in the pantry. And she said, did you use the peppers that were in there? And I said, yeah, I put them in the food processor and pureed all this. She said, I am so sorry. I meant to tell you just to use the sauce, not to use the peppers. And she said, this stuff is pretty hot. And Caroline likes spicy food. She said, I'm okay with it, but you may want to try it to see if it's okay for you. And so I got a spoon out, and I went over, I lifted the lid of the crock pot, I get a taste of this sauce, and I put it in my mouth, and the first thing that registers is the sweetness between the brown sugar and the honey, and so I've got that tastes pretty good. There's a little bit of kick to it to be sure, and then I swallow it, and after I swallowed it, the flames of hell itself began to pour from my throat and into my mouth, and I was just disgusted with myself. You know, ribs aren't cheap to begin with, and now we've got these ribs that only Caroline's got the lead stomach enough to be able to eat this, and the kids, we can't give this to them. And so I thought, we've absolutely ruined these things. But then one of us had the thought, and what we decided to do, we took the ribs out of the crock pot, we emptied that sauce out, went to the sink and washed all the ribs off, made another batch of sauce, put them back in there, and the day was saved. But we went to all that trouble because, quite frankly, I had put something into the ribs that shouldn't have been there. You know, the truth is that good ribs and good marriages share something in common, namely this. Both of them can be ruined. They can be spoiled by what you put in them. Both of them can be ruined by what you put in them. As the Lord went to the trouble to give to us what we know as the Ten Commandments, God was so concerned about the family, and specifically so concerned about marriages, that He wanted to make sure that we understand there are some things that absolutely should never find themselves in the context of a marriage. And He gave us that in the 7th commandment, where He says, you shall not commit adultery. But the truth is that we have that clear command, you shall not commit adultery. And it's easy to say, okay, I haven't done that. I don't plan on doing that. And easy to say, well, okay, that's all God expects of me. That's the only thing that can really get into my marriage that could potentially really ruin it. But the truth is that as Jesus expounded and fleshed out the standards of God, He made clear that there's more to it than this. So what is it that God wants us to do, or what is it that He wants us to be on guard against to ensure the safety and the integrity of our marriages? We see the answer to that question in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 27. If you would look with me there, Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 27. And Lily has asked me to help her with Wednesday night supper, and so I will be... I'm just messing with you. Anyway, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Jesus is talking here, and He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell." Well, obviously, the focal thought of what Jesus is talking about here is the seventh commandment. But as Jesus is reiterating, He's fleshing out this commandment to give us some clear instruction as His followers to say that there are some things that ought not be part of your marriage. Specifically, He starts by saying that you should not, I should not, we should not defile our marriages with infidelity. Do not defile your marriage with infidelity. Well, as we are continuing and working our way through completion, this walk through the Ten Commandments, we find Jesus dealing with the seventh commandment here as part of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's interesting that Jesus does as He did in the instance the other week when we dealt with murder. Jesus said, "You've heard it said, 'You shall not murder,' but I say to you." Well, a couple of things are noteworthy about this. First of all, Jesus is repeating these commandments. So He's saying that this is something that's worth paying attention to. He's reiterating the commandments, but as He does so, He's fleshing out the full measure of God's expectation. It's not that Jesus is trying to add to or try to take away, but to fully flesh out the expectation, the standard of God. And as He does so, there's more to this than would first meet the eye. And so He begins by saying, "You have heard it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And He's saying to this crowd of people that have gathered as He's sharing this message, you have heard this. And the truth is, this Jewish audience had heard this since infancy. They had been exposed, as generations before them had been exposed to the commandments of God, specifically the Ten Commandments. They'd heard this over and over and over again. Jesus is saying, you're familiar with this. But then He says, "I say to you," in verse 28. Now again, He's not trying to say, erase that commandment, don't pay attention to it. Rather, He says that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her, and He starts talking about lust and equating that to be morally the equivalent of adultery. Jesus, again, is not trying to take away or diminish the commandment, but He's trying to make clear what God's expectation is. And the first expectation has to do with the basic commandment itself. You shall not, do not do this, do not commit adultery. It's interesting that the word that's used there that's translated as adultery in Greek is the word moikos. And moikos literally means to have sexual relations with any that is not your spouse. So this prohibits two things. One, a single person engaging in a sexual relationship with a married person, and a married person having sexual relations with any that is not their spouse. So Jesus is saying, listen, God's on record. This is wrong. Do not do this. And He says, do not commit adultery, that Greek word moikos. Now, it's interesting, though, that our English word adultery doesn't come from the Greek word. It actually comes from the Latin word adulterare, which literally means to sully or to pollute. And so if you take that together with what Jesus is saying, He's saying, listen, do not sully, do not pollute your marriage, do not pollute the relationship that you have with your spouse with any measure of infidelity. You should not pollute your marriage with infidelity or adultery. Now, we hear a lot today about pollution. And there's air pollution, there's soil pollution, there's water pollution. You've got the EPA with all of its standards and regulation and intervention to make sure that we're trying to take as good a care as we can of the earth that God's entrusted to our care. So we hear a lot about pollution these days. But what's interesting is when we're talking about pollution, what are we talking about? We're talking about the interjection of something into a circumstance or into an environment that has a detrimental effect. The inclusion or the interjection of something into an environment that has a detrimental effect. Jesus is saying, don't pollute, do not interject into your marriage infidelity because of the harm that that will create. I was just talking with someone in the past week or so about what it was like when I was little riding my bike. And when I would ride my bike, my favorite places to ride were on gravel roads. Loved to ride on gravel roads for a couple of reasons. One, I loved the sound that it made. It was a lot cooler than just riding on pavement or on sidewalk or in the grass. It just sounds cool to ride your bike on gravel. Beyond that, if you were going fast enough or if you would skid a little bit, you could create this dust trail behind you. And of course, that's really cool if you're a little boy. And so I loved this. And so I really enjoyed riding on gravel roads for those reasons. But there was one gravel road that I would ride on periodically that didn't give me quite the same kick. This particular gravel road was in my hometown of Matthews, and it was a fairly long road that would lead to this nursery, not baby nursery, but plant, tree, shrub nursery. And they had this gravel road leading to it, and you couldn't kick up any dust on this road because once or twice a year they would have an oil truck come through there with old used motor oil, and they would spray that road. And some of you remembered this from years past. They would spray a gravel road with old used motor oil. The benefit of that is a couple. First of all, with it being oil and water don't mix, and so rain's not going to quickly wash it away. But it would soak into the gravel, and it would create dust from just floating everywhere. That way, when customers would go to this nursery, their cars wouldn't be filthy from all the dust that would be created by driving down this gravel road. And so I was talking about this and remembering this from years gone by, and I thought about this fact. Could you imagine if you had a gravel road today and decided, hey, I want to put hundreds or thousands of gallons of used motor oil out and just spray that? What do you think would happen to you? I mean, the EPA would come out and they would put you under the jail. I mean, the fines that you would face, the trouble that you would get in, it'd just be colossal. We just think this is crazy. We can't do something like that today because, for one thing, that oil just stays around. It just doesn't get onto the gravel. It soaks into the soil. It pollutes the soil, and eventually it works its way down to the water table, polluting wells and the water table itself. But you could argue, well, you know, oil is a naturally occurring substance, isn't it? Sure it is. It may come, we get it from out of the ground, and so I'm just kind of putting it back in the ground. It's a natural substance. What's the big deal? It came out of the ground, I'm putting it back in the ground. Well, the reason that you would get into trouble is because you are polluting the ground and eventually the water itself. What you are doing is taking a natural thing and using it in ways or putting it in a place or in a context or an environment that causes harm. The problem isn't that you're using something natural. The problem is how it is that you are using it. Now, we've got to recognize that when we talk about sexual relations, we're talking about a gift that God has given to us. God has wired us to be sexual beings. He has given us those thoughts and these feelings of attractiveness. God has wired us or physically made us anatomically to engage in this act. So we are wired for this. Sex is absolutely natural, but as God has given this gift to us, He's done so with a plan. And the plan is very simple. One man and one woman in the context of marriage exclusively for a lifetime. Amen. That's the plan. That's the plan. And when you violate those standards, when you engage sex as a natural act, you could argue, when you interject that, whether the individual is married or you're married, you're engaging this with someone other than your spouse, you're taking something that's natural, something that is a God-given gift, but you're using it in ways that are detrimental. Absolutely, it's detrimental. It will destroy your marriage. It can destroy the relationship with your children. It will rob you of your integrity, your character, your reputation. All sorts of damage can come from this. And so Jesus makes it very plain. Do not sully. Do not pollute your marriage with infidelity. Now, you could be here today, and it's entirely possible that you have violated this commandment in this way. And I'm not here today to wag my finger at you and say, "Well, golly, Shazam." I'm not here to Gomer Pyle you today or to judge you and to wag my finger at you, but I am here today to say this. If you have done this, if you have violated your marriage and the covenant relationship that you entered into with your spouse by engaging in infidelity, you have polluted your marriage. You have polluted your relationship. But here's the good news. Pollution can be cleaned up. Pollution can be cleaned up. The Exxon Valdez, cleaned up. Soil pollution from a gas station that used to be there, from a leaky gas tank, that can be cleaned up. Now, the Exxon Valdez or this cleaned up soil at old gas stations, I'm not here to say to you that it is going to be like it would have been without that pollution. What I am here today to say is that it can still be good. It can still be good. Just because you have violated this commandment doesn't mean that all hope is gone, that all hope is dashed. God can forgive you, God can cleanse you, and God can work through circumstances to save your marriage. But what He wants you to do is to commit yourself, whether you've engaged in this or not. Do not pollute, do not sully, do not defile your marriage with infidelity. But Jesus goes a step further by saying this: do not defile your heart with your eye. Do not defile your heart with your eye. So in verse 27, Jesus repeats the commandment. You've heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, Jesus says, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, it's interesting when Jesus says whoever looks. The Greek word there for looks is blepo. It's a present participle. That means it's continuing action. So what I want you to understand in terms of the language that Jesus is using is this. There's looking, and then there's looking. I mean, there is noticing, and then there is studying. There is recognizing, and then there's dwelling on. And that's what Jesus is forbidding. He's saying that you should not, or if you are to look, to gaze, to study with one where, or to the extent or the level that you in your mind or your heart beginning to think about sexual thoughts towards this person, Jesus is saying, though you might not have ever laid hands on them, never engaged in any physical act, though this other person may be completely unaware, you are just as guilty of violating the seventh commandment as if you had gone to bed with them. So Jesus is saying, listen, it's not just important the outward, it's not just important the exterior, the outward behavior, it's also important as to what's going on in the heart. Now, it's interesting, though, that Jesus puts this in a masculine context, doesn't he? He says, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her. He doesn't say whoever looks at a man. He says whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I mean, it's not accidental, the intentional use of masculine pronouns. Look at a woman, his heart. Well, quite frankly, that stands to reason. And the reason is this. Men, and we know this, behavioral scientists have confirmed to be true what we have known from centuries worth of experience, which is this. Men are far more visually stimulated than women. Men far more visually stimulated than women. If the pornography industry were contingent upon its support exclusively from women, it would probably be bankrupt and out of business by the end of the week. That industry makes its money on the backs of men. Why? Because men are exponentially more visually stimulated than women. It's not accidental that Jesus is saying this. Whoever looks at a woman. He's talking, this has specific application for men. It's not that women can't do this, but this is predominantly a struggle for men. So what is Jesus saying then? That guys, you should go around especially if you are married, throughout the day, you should have a welding mask on. And when you're at home and your wife is in front of you, then you can raise it and look at her. But as soon as you need to go to the grocery store or once you get out of your car, go ahead and lower that mask so that you can't see any other woman. Is that what Jesus is saying? No, that's emphatically what He's not saying. Again, there's all the difference in the world between observing and recognizing and staring and gazing and entertaining. What Jesus is specifically forbidding is seeing someone, and it's going to be natural that men or women, you're going to see members of the opposite sex, whether you were single or whether you were married, you're going to see this person and you're going to think, boy, they are good looking. That's a handsome man or that's a beautiful woman. And you'll see this, you'll recognize this, you'll understand this, you'll recognize this to be true. You may even further recognize in your mind and your heart, this is someone that I find to be visually attractive to me. What Jesus is saying, you'd better stop there. You stop there, because when you continue to look and when you continue to study, what happens is that the mind and the heart begin to get engaged to the point where you are mentally entertaining sexual thoughts of being in a sexual encounter with this particular person. And Jesus is saying you can do that and be in violation of this command, never having touched, never having physically gone to bed with anybody, because you can defile your heart just by what your eye sees. You can violate your heart just by what it is that you're looking at. And so Jesus makes very clear, do not defile your heart with your eye. And so to provide help in this, whether man or woman, Jesus says in verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. In verse 30, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you. So is Jesus here arguing for self-mutilation? If you entertain a sinful thought, lustful thought, go ahead and start lopping eyes out and cutting hands off. Is that what He's arguing? No, it's clear that Jesus is using hyperbole here, that He's using figurative language to really inflate and to exaggerate what's going on to communicate His point. So what is Jesus saying? First of all, He talks about the eyes and He talks about the hands. These are primary offenders in sexual impropriety. And He says, if these cause you to sin, if your eye, your hand causes you to sin. The word that's translated there as sin is the Greek word scandalon. It gives us our English word scandal. And so you take that together. Jesus says if your eye and what you look at, if your hand or what you could touch causes you to act in a way that causes scandal, He says it's better to cut it off than to live the rest of your life with it. He's saying, cut this off, cut the hand off, remove the eye. Well, again, He's not arguing for physical self-mutilation, so what's His point? The point, I believe, very simply is this. You need to go to whatever steps necessary, however drastic they may be. If you cannot not be tempted by an individual, then you need to make sure that you cut off that temptation. That you remove yourself, you somehow get rid of that temptation. Well, how does this work? Well, this past Tuesday night, I decided I was going to do something great for my family, something really healthy. And so I went to Donut World to buy some donuts on Tuesday night. And so I get a dozen donuts, and I bring them home because I was wanting one that night. I was wanting one. Anyway, I was wanting some of them that night, and the plan was that we'd have plenty left over for the kids for breakfast in the morning. And so I had some on Tuesday night. On Wednesday morning, we get up, and the kids are excited to see that we've got donuts there. And so Nathan, Andrew, Philip, Catherine, they all are there enjoying these donuts. And that night when I got home, after the kids had gone to bed, I noticed that on the cabinet there was still this box of donuts. And I opened the lid, and there were 3 half donuts there. And so I said to Caroline, the boys didn't eat all of these donuts. I said, there's 3 halves in here. I said, do you care if I eat them? And she said, no, help yourself. And so I decided at this point, I'm going to finish these donuts off. And so what I did, I ate 2 of these halves. And there was this other half that I really just don't want that much. And so I left it there with this thought. I'm going to either throw that away or eat that before morning because I don't want any trouble. Well, the problem is I forgot to either throw it away or to eat it. And so the next morning, when the kids get up, they go into the kitchen and they see on the counter there is this donut box. They raise it and there is now only one half of one donut in there. Nathan decides that's his donut, left from the day before. Andrew argues with him to say, no, that's my donut left before. And of course, Big Phil thinks that any donut belongs to him. And so they are all arguing as to who gets this donut. I don't remember exactly what happened, but the truth is we had a mess on our hands. And everybody's arguing and fussing and feuding with each other, saying it's mine, no, it's mine, it's mine, no, it's mine. And so all this argument going on. Why did we have this mess? Because I left that out. If I had just gotten rid of it, there would have been no fussing, no argument, no dissension. If I had just gotten rid of the temptation. If I had just gotten rid of the temptation, I wouldn't have had any of these problems. Likewise, if what you see with your eye causes you in your mind and in your heart to entertain thoughts that you know are displeasing to the Lord, if what you see with your eye puts you in jeopardy of polluting your heart, if you cannot resist that temptation, well, remove the temptation from yourself or remove yourself from the temptation. Well, in terms of practical application, what does this mean, or what does it suggest that we should do? Well, based on what Jesus is saying, now he's talking about big stuff. Cut your hand off, pluck your eye out. Big things. He's saying go to whatever extreme that you need to so that this does not become a problem. For some, it may mean that there's some movie channels that you need to get rid of in your cable lineup. Or maybe that you need to get rid of cable altogether. It may mean that the internet in your house is a problem. Maybe that you need to put some internet filtering on, or that you need to remove the internet from your family. It may be that there are some people that you spend a lot of time with at work of the opposite sex that you've got to decide at this point, okay, we just can't be close anymore, and we're going to only have a civil professional relationship, and that's it. For some, it may mean that there's someone that you just don't speak to anymore, that you cut off that relationship. Jesus' point very simply is this: you do whatever it takes so that your eye does not pollute your heart. Again, because it's not just the exterior, the outward action that matters, it's what's going on the inside. And Jesus says, go to whatever lengths, go to whatever extremes that are necessary to ensure that you not only don't pollute your marriage with infidelity, but that you don't pollute your heart by what you see through your eyes. But in fleshing this out, Jesus adds one more thought, which is this: do not defile your eternity, or do not defile the eternal with the temporary. Do not defile the eternity with the temporary. Again, when Jesus is sharing and reiterating and fleshing out the seventh commandment, He's not just talking again about outward behavior. He's saying it's what's on the inside that counts. You can be in violation of this, never having physically done anything, just in your mind and in your heart, what it is that you entertain. After all, before adultery ever takes place physically, it first occurs on the inside. And so Jesus has just used this exaggerated illustration, this hyperbole. And He says again in verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you. Because, He says, it's more profitable that one of your members perish, that just a part of you perishes, as opposed to the whole body being cast into hell. Likewise, He says in verse 30, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you. It's more profitable for you that one of your members. So it's better to lose part of the body than to lose all of the body in hell. Well, he's again not arguing for physical mutilation, so what exactly is Jesus talking about? First of all, He's saying to us, we need to go to whatever extreme that is necessary, even if it is extreme, if the temptation is too great for us to remove ourselves or to remove the temptation from us. And Jesus says that it is beneficial to do that, even if there is significant cost involved, because it's better to lose a little than to use a lot. The argument is from the lesser to the greater. Now, removing yourself from these temptations or removing these temptations from you, it may mean that you end some friendships, that you end some relationships, that it makes a different decision in who that is that you hire as an assistant, whatever it is. There can be some sacrifice and some cost involved. Jesus says it's better to pay a little bit of cost than to pay a great cost. Let me give an example of this. Catherine, our daughter, just turned 1 back in January, and she still takes 2 naps a day. Typically about 8:30 in the morning, she'll sleep for about an hour, and then she gets back up, and then after lunch, around 1 o'clock, she'll lay back down, typically for a couple of hours. And so Fridays, that's typically my day off, and for Caroline, that means that this is typically within a week her first opportunity to do something without having a gaggle of kids chasing her. And so if she needs to go to the store, she needs to get her hair done, she needs to do something, this is a great opportunity while I can watch the kids. And so if Caroline leaves by 8:30, I'm going to put Catherine down to bed for that morning nap. And it may be that she jabbers for a little bit, but typically in short order, she's going to drift off to sleep. Now, when it gets to be about 10 o'clock, though, if Catherine has not already gotten up, what I'm going to do is to go in there and wake her up. I'm going to get her up out of the bed. Now, that seems to violate a cardinal rule of parenting, which is, namely, never wake a sleeping child. Now, why would you do this? Why would you do this? Well, I do so for this reason. If she were to sleep another 15 minutes, another 30 minutes, especially another 45 minutes to an hour, if I let her sleep till 10:30, 10:45, 11 o'clock, well, the afternoon is shot. She's just absolutely not going to take that longer nap in the afternoon. I would rather give up another 15 or 20 minutes of quiet to have a whole afternoon of peace. I'd rather lose a little so that I can get a lot more. That's what Jesus is talking about here. Better to pay a smaller price than to pay a much greater price. Well, what are the prices? What are the costs of adultery? Well, obviously the most evident cost is that you can lose your marriage, and you can lose your marriage and everything that you've built over potentially decades. That can be lost. You can lose your home through the divorce. You can lose income. Beyond that, you can lose the relationship that you have with your children, the reputation that you have in terms of being a man or woman of character and integrity, not only in your home, but in your workplace, in your church, and the community. You can lose all of those things. But what Jesus is talking about here is even loss on a greater degree. Notice what he says. He said, it's better to cut all this off, he says, than to be, in verse 29, cast into hell. Verse 30, it's better that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Well, is Jesus describing now the unpardonable sin, that adultery now, if you commit that, either in act or in thought, that's going to send you to hell? What's he talking about? Well, I believe Paul makes this clear for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul says this, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God?" So he's saying lost people will not get heaven. And then he describes and paints the picture of lost people. Verse 9, "Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, idolaters, homosexuals, sodomites, thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners, nor adulterers will inherit the kingdom of God." Now, what's Paul saying here? What's Jesus trying to communicate here? Well, I believe both are trying to describe very simply this thought. Saved people act in particular ways. Lost people act in particular ways. Lost people do not simply commit acts of sin, they commit lifestyles of sin. That's what Paul is painting the picture of in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Someone who is committing this and living in this. That's a lost person. And so Jesus, when he's talking about cutting the hand off, cutting the eye off, better to lose this than to be cast into hell, again, what's he trying to communicate? Well, I believe very simply it's this. Someone that is a Christian, someone that has a genuine relationship with Christ, they absolutely can violate the seventh commandment. Whether in deed or in thought, in their heart or in their mind, they can violate this commandment. But when they do so, they do not remain in it. They recognize that they have sinned, they come to God in confession, they experience God's forgiveness, and that changes. One that is lost commits this and remains in this, and they're demonstrating, I do not belong to Christ, and if they do not belong to Christ, then heaven will not belong to them. And that's why Jesus is saying, man, it is so much better to lose a little than to lose everything. It's better to forego some temporary pleasure in this life so that you can have eternal bliss when this life is over. Do not defile, do not corrupt, do not pollute the eternal with the temporary. Do not, Jesus says, commit adultery. God says, do not commit adultery. So what does this all have to do with us today? Well, maybe you're here today and maybe those around you have no idea. It could even be that your spouse has no idea that perhaps even indeed you have violated this commandment. I have good news for you. And the good news is that God can forgive you. And He can help you with your spouse to work through this. And it will not be what it could have been, but it can still be good. And God can save your marriage. He can rescue your character. But maybe what it is that you're here today and you're thinking, you know, I've never engaged physically in this, but that whole idea of what's going on in the heart and the mind, man, that really cuts me because that's been going on. What is it that God is saying needs to get out? What needs to be cut off? What needs to be changed? What relationships? What circumstance? What means of entertainment? What of those things need to be changed? Ultimately, based on this thought, would you rather have the pleasures of the moment or would you rather have the bliss of eternity? It's up to you. Jesus says, God says, do not pollute, do not defile your marriage. Won't you bow your heads with me?